When Garrett Sullivan signed the foreclosure papers on the old Braddock Sawmill for $450, the bank clerk looked at him like he had just purchased his own grave. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 60 years old, with reading glasses perched on her nose, and 30 years of small-town banking experience etched into the lines around her eyes. She had seen desperate men make desperate choices before. She had watched farmers sign away land their grandfathers had cleared. She had processed foreclosures on homes where children's hype marks still decorated the doorframes. But this particular transaction seemed to trouble her in a way the others had not. She slid the paperwork across the counter slowly, as if giving him one final chance to reconsider. Garrett signed anyway. The building had not processed timber in 17 years. Its machinery had rusted into sculptures of industrial decay. Its roof sagged under the weight of too many Montana winters. The windows that remained unbroken were so caked with grime that they admitted light only as a gray suggestion of the world outside. But Garrett was not buying potential. He was not buying an investment opportunity, or a fixer-upper project, or a chance to restore historical architecture. He was buying shelter. Shelter for himself and his 8-year-old daughter Nora, because the rent on their trailer was 3 weeks overdue, and his construction job had dried up with the first November snow, and the landlord had made it clear that sympathy had its limits. Sometimes desperation looks like opportunity if you squint hard enough. Outside the bank, the December air bit through Garrett's worn jacket as he walked back to his truck. Nora sat in the passenger seat, her small face pressed against the window, watching him approach with eyes that held too much understanding for 8 years old. She had developed that look over the past 2 years, ever since her mother, Claire, had walked out on them both without warning or explanation. Just a note on the kitchen table that said she could not do this anymore, whatever this was. Garrett had stopped trying to interpret it. Some questions did not have answers worth finding. He climbed into the truck and sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel, staring at the key in his palm. Ancient brass worn smooth by decades of use. It felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with its actual weight. Nora did not ask if he had gotten the building. She already knew. She had learned to read the set of his shoulders the particular way he held his jaw when something was decided. Instead, she simply said, "Can we go see it now?" Garrett started the engine. The drive from Millbrook's small downtown to the Sawmill property took 11 minutes on roads that had seen better days. The town itself had seen better days. Like so many communities built on extraction industries, Millbrook had flourished when the timber was flowing and the mill was humming and good jobs were plentiful. Then the timber contracts went elsewhere. The mill fell silent, and the town began its slow fade into the kind of place young people left and old people remembered. The sawmill sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through overgrown forest, the trees pressing close on either side, like they were trying to reclaim what humans had briefly borrowed. Garrett's truck bounced over potholes and ruts that spoke of years without maintenance, the suspension creaking in protest. Then the trees fell away, and there it was. 3 stories of weathered timber and broken windows surrounded by acres of overgrown lot where mountains of sawdust had once stood. The building loomed against the gray December sky, like something from another century, which in many ways it was. A faded sign still hung above the main entrance letters, barely visible through years of grime and neglect. Braddock Timber Company. established 1891. The name meant nothing to Garrett, just another piece of forgotten history in a valley full of them. Nora's small hand found his as they stood in the gravel parking lot, his truck's engine ticking as it cooled. Despite the cold, despite the fear that surely lurked somewhere beneath her composed exterior, she pressed close to his side and studied the building with something that might have been curiosity. "It looks scary, Dad." Garrett could not argue with that assessment. The sawmill looked like exactly what it was. Abandoned, possibly dangerous, and definitely not the kind of place a responsible parent would bring a child to live. But responsibility was a luxury he could no longer afford. The math was brutally simple. $450 for the building versus $800 a month for the moldy trailer they had been calling home. The sawmill had 4 walls and a mostly intact roof. That made it a mansion compared to the alternative, which was his truck. "It's just old," Garrett said, injecting confidence he did not feel into his voice. "Old doesn't mean bad. Old means sturdy. They built things to last back then." Nora looked up at him with those too perceptive eyes, the ones that saw through his forced optimism, but chose not to challenge it. She had learned that particular kindness somewhere in the wreckage of the past 2 years. "Okay, Dad." The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, and the main door swung open with a groan that echoed through the cavernous space beyond. The interior smelled of dust and machine oil, and something organic that Garrett could not quite identify. Decay, maybe. Or just time concentrated and undisturbed. What little December light filtered through the grimy windows revealed a vast open space filled with silent machinery. Massive saws, conveyor systems, timber processing equipment. All of it stood frozen in mid-operation, as if the workers had simply walked away one day and never returned. Which Garrett suspected was probably close to the truth. Nora stayed close to his side as they explored, their footsteps echoing on the concrete floor, in a way that made the space feel even larger than it was. Cathedral ceilings disappeared into shadows above. Metal stairs led to a second floor where offices had once bustled with activity, their doors now hanging open to reveal rooms filled with abandoned filing cabinets and desks buried under years of accumulated dust. "Can we really live here?" Nora asked quietly, her voice small in the massive space. Garrett surveyed their new home with what he hoped looked like optimism. "We'll make it work. See that office up there? The one with the big window. We'll clean it out. Set up our beds. I can rig up some heating, get the electricity sorted. It'll be an adventure." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "I don't like adventures anymore," Nora said softly. The statement hit Garrett harder than she probably intended. Nora used to love adventures. Before Claire left, before the construction work dried up, before their life became a series of increasingly desperate compromises, Nora had been fearless. She would climb trees and explore creeks and invent elaborate games that could occupy her for hours. Now she flinched at changes. She clung to routine. She looked at the world through eyes that expected disappointment. Garrett knelt down to her level, his knees protesting against the cold concrete. "I know things have been hard, sweetheart. I know you didn't ask for any of this. But I promise you, we're going to be okay. This place might not look like much now, but it's ours. Nobody can kick us out. Nobody can raise the rent. We just need to make it livable." Nora studied his face with that too perceptive gaze. You promise. Garrett had learned the hard way that promises to children carried weight you could not always bear. But what else could he offer her? "I promise we'll try our hardest." It was not much of a promise, but it was honest. Nora seemed to accept it, nodding slightly before turning her attention back to exploring their strange new home. They spent the remaining daylight hours doing basic reconnaissance. Garrett tested light switches, finding to his relief that the electricity still functioned, though several fixtures had burned out bulbs. The plumbing proved more problematic. Water flowed when he turned on a rusted faucet in what had been the facility's bathroom, but it ran brown for several minutes before clearing. The toilet functioned, which Garrett counted as a significant victory. The upper floors revealed more offices, a break room with a refrigerator that had become a science experiment in mold cultivation, and storage areas packed with boxes of old paperwork and supplies. Garrett made mental notes of what could be salvaged. Cleaning supplies, some basic tools, even a few folding chairs that might be serviceable once wiped down. As the winter sun began its early descent toward the mountains, Garrett started hauling their possessions from the truck. They did not have much. 2 suitcases of clothes, a box of Nora's toys and books, his tool bag, sleeping bags and blankets, a portable camping stove, a cooler with the perishable food they had managed to salvage from the trailer. It took 3 trips to get everything inside. Each one emphasized just how little they had accumulated in 8 years of Nora's life. He chose the largest office on the 2nd floor for their living space. It had windows facing east, which would catch the morning sun, and a door that still closed properly. Garrett swept up the worst of the dust and debris, then laid out their sleeping bags on the floor. The camping stove went in one corner, their food supplies in another. Nora arranged her stuffed animals on the windowsill with careful precision, creating order in the chaos. Her favorite, a worn rabbit named Professor Whiskers that Claire had given her for her 3rd birthday, took the place of honor in the center. "It's like camping," Garrett offered, watching her sort through her small collection of belongings. "Camping is supposed to be temporary," Nora replied without looking up. Garrett had no response to that. Instead, he focused on practical tasks. Heating would be the immediate challenge. The sawmill had ancient radiators throughout connected to a boiler system that Garrett suspected had not functioned in years. For tonight, he had brought a small electric space heater that would at least keep their room from freezing. Tomorrow, he would investigate the boiler situation more thoroughly. They ate dinner sitting on the floor of their new room. Sandwiches made from supplies Garrett had picked up at the gas station on their way into town. Nora chewed slowly, her eyes wandering around the bare office walls, while outside darkness fell completely, turning the windows into black mirrors that reflected the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. "Tell me about Mom," Nora said suddenly. The request surprised Garrett. Nora rarely asked about Claire anymore. The first few months after she left, Nora had asked constantly, "Where was Mom? When was she coming back?" Did she not love them anymore? Garrett had fumbled through explanations that satisfied neither of them, eventually settling on variations of Mom needed to go figure some things out. And it's complicated. After a while, Nora stopped asking. Garrett had thought that meant acceptance. Now he wondered if it had just been retreat. "What do you want to know?" he asked carefully. Nora picked at her sandwich. Do you think she's ever coming back? Garrett had wrestled with this question himself for 2 years. Claire had left no forwarding address, no contact information beyond a disconnected cell phone number. She had emptied their meager joint savings account and vanished as completely as if she had never existed. For the first year, Garrett had harbored hope that she would call, that she would realize her mistake, that she would come home. The second year had been about accepting that she would not. "I don't know, honey," Garrett said honestly. "I used to think she would. Now I'm not sure." Nora absorbed this quietly. Then, "I don't want her to." The statement startled Garrett. "You don't?" "She made you sad. She made me sad. If she came back, she'd probably just leave again." Nora finally looked up, her eyes fierce in a way that seemed too old for 8. "I don't want you to be sad anymore, Dad." Garrett felt something crack open in his chest. He crossed the small space and pulled Nora into his arms, holding her tight against him, while she buried her face in his shoulder. "I'm not sad when I'm with you," he said into her hair. "You're my best thing, Nora. No matter what happens, no matter where we end up, you're my best thing." They stayed like that for a long moment, father and daughter clinging to each other in their strange new home, while the December wind whistled through gaps in the old building, and the machinery below stood silent witness to their small moment of connection. Eventually, Nora pulled back and wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "Can you read to me?" Garrett smiled, grateful for the return to routine. "What do we have?" They had brought 3 books from the trailer. Nora chose Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, a battered paperback she had loved since before she could read the words herself. Garrett propped himself against the wall. Nora settled into her sleeping bag beside him, and he began to read. She fell asleep somewhere in chapter 4, her breathing evening out into the deep rhythm of childhood rest. Garrett continued reading softly for a few more pages, reluctant to stop this small piece of normalcy. Finally, he closed the book and simply sat there, watching his daughter sleep in their strange new home. The sawmill made sounds at night, wood creaking, metal groaning, the wind finding its way through gaps in the structure. Normal sounds for an old building, Garrett told himself, even as they raised the hairs on the back of his neck. He had grown up in apartments and rental houses, not sprawling industrial relics. The sheer size of the place, the echoing spaces below the shadows that pressed against their small island of light, all of it felt overwhelming in the darkness. Garrett checked the space heater to make sure it was functioning safely, then settled into his own sleeping bag. Sleep came slowly interrupted by unfamiliar sounds in the hard floor beneath him, and the weight of uncertainty that had become his constant companion. At some point in the early morning hours, exhaustion finally won. He woke to pale winter light filtering through dirty windows, and Nora already awake, sitting cross-legged on her sleeping bag and drawing in her notebook. Garrett had bought her that notebook and a pack of colored pencils 3 months ago, back when he still had steady work. She had filled half of it already with elaborate drawings of imaginary worlds that looked nothing like their actual life. "Morning, kiddo," Garrett said, his voice rough from sleep and cold air. "Morning," Nora replied without looking up from her drawing. "The building makes weird sounds at night. Old places do that. It's just the wood settling, the temperature changing. Nothing to worry about." Nora nodded but did not look convinced. Garrett could not blame her. In daylight, the sawmill looked less menacing but no more welcoming. Just old, vast, and fundamentally empty. Garrett made them a basic breakfast on the camping stove. Instant oatmeal and the last of the orange juice. As they ate, he outlined his plan for the day. First priority was getting the boiler system evaluated. If it could be repaired, they would have heat throughout the building. If not, he would need to figure out alternative heating solutions before the real winter cold set in. Second priority was making their living space more habitable. That meant deep cleaning finding or building proper furniture, maybe hanging some curtains to make it feel less institutional. "Can I explore while you work?" Nora asked. Garrett hesitated. The sawmill was large, potentially dangerous with its old machinery and questionable structural integrity, but keeping Nora confined to one office seemed cruel, and he could not watch her constantly while trying to assess the building's systems. "You can explore the second floor," Garrett compromised, "but you stay away from the machinery downstairs, and you stay where I can hear you, if you call." "Deal." "Deal." Nora agreed readily. They spent the morning in parallel tasks. Garrett descended to the boiler room, a dark cave beneath the main processing floor, accessed by a narrow staircase that creaked alarmingly under his weight. The boiler itself was a monster from another era. Massive cast iron covered in a maze of pipes and valves. Garrett knew basic construction and maintenance, but this antique equipment was beyond his expertise. He would need to call in a specialist, which meant money he did not have. Meanwhile, Nora's footsteps echoed overhead as she wandered the second-floor offices. Occasionally, she would call down to him, reporting her discoveries. An office with old maps still pinned to the walls. A storage room full of dusty hard hats. A break room with a calendar frozen on March 2007. Garrett was making notes on the boiler system, trying to determine what might be salvageable when Nora's voice cut through the building with unusual urgency. "Dad, come quick." Garrett was up the stairs faster than he thought possible, heart hammering against his ribs. Nora's tone had not been panic exactly, but something close, something that demanded immediate attention. He found her standing at the far end of the second-floor hallway, in front of a wall of dark wood paneling that looked identical to the rest of the building's interior. "What's wrong?" Garrett asked, scanning for danger and finding none visible. "Nothing's wrong," Nora said, her eyes bright with something he had not seen in months. Excitement. "But look at this." She pressed her hand against what appeared to be solid wall, and a section of the paneling swung inward with a soft click, revealing a narrow doorway that Garrett would have sworn was not there moments before. "It's a secret door," Nora whispered, as if speaking loudly might close it again. "I was leaning against the wall when I was drawing, and I felt it move." Garrett approached cautiously, his construction worker's eye examining the mechanism. The door was cleverly designed, its seams invisible when closed, operated by a hidden catch, disguised as a decorative knot in the wood grain. He had walked past this wall at least a dozen times in the past day, without noticing anything unusual. Beyond the doorway, darkness suggested a space larger than a simple closet. "Stay here," Garrett instructed Nora. He pulled out his phone and activated its flashlight function, then stepped through the hidden door. The room beyond was roughly 12 feet square, windowless, and completely concealed within the building's structure. As Garrett's phone light swept across the space, it revealed something that made his breath catch in his throat. The room was furnished. A heavy wooden desk dominated one wall, its surface clear. except for a single leather-bound book. Shelves lined another wall filled with what appeared to be record books and files, their spines faded but intact. The furniture was coated in dust, but beneath that dust Garrett could see quality, real craftsmanship, the kind of woodwork that took skill and time and pride. But what commanded his attention was the wall opposite the door. A large portrait hung there in an ornate gilded frame. The painting showed a man in his 60s, dressed in the formal style of the early 20th century. He sat in a high-backed chair, with one hand resting on a silver-headed cane. His expression stern, but not unkind. The eyes seemed to follow Garrett as he moved a trick of the artist's skill that felt unsettling in the hidden room's darkness. Beneath the portrait, a small brass plate bore an inscription that Garrett had to step closer to read. Cornelius Braddock, 1867 to 1943, founder Braddock Timber Company. "What is it?" Nora called from the doorway, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. "It's a hidden office," Garrett said slowly, his voice strange in his own ears. "I think it belonged to the man who built this place." Nora slipped past him, despite his earlier instruction to stay put, her eyes wide as she took in the secret room. Why would someone hide their office? It was a good question. Garrett had no answer. He moved to the desk, examining it more closely. The wood was dark with age, but well-maintained, as if someone had cared for it right up until the building's abandonment. The leather ledger sat centered on the desk surface, pristine, despite the dust covering everything else. Pristine, Garrett realized with a chill, as if it had been protected somehow. Preserved. He reached for it, then hesitated. Something about this moment felt significant. Like opening that ledger would cross a threshold he could not uncross, which was ridiculous. It was just an old book in an abandoned building he had legally purchased for $450. He opened the ledger. The first page contained a single line of text, written in precise, old-fashioned script that must have taken considerable care to produce. For the one who finds this having purchased what others abandoned. You have earned the right to know what they never did. Garrett's hands trembled slightly as he turned to the next page where detailed entries began. Not business records as he had expected. Not financial statements or timber contracts or employee rosters. Instructions, locations, and numbers that made Garrett's vision blur as he tried to process what he was reading. Cornelius Braddock had not trusted banks. The ledger made that much clear within the first dozen pages. The man had lived through the stock market crash of 1929. He had watched neighbors lose everything to institutions they believed were safe. Families destroyed overnight, life savings evaporating like morning mist. So he had created his own security. Systematically, over more than a decade, Cornelius Braddock had hidden portions of his wealth across the Sawmill property. Gold coins purchased quietly from dealers in Helena and Billings. Bearer bonds that could not be traced. Cash in denominations that would seem quaint now, but represented fortunes in their time. The ledger provided maps, measurements from permanent landmarks, depth specifications, everything needed to recover what Cornelius had called his legacy insurance. 6 caches in total. 6 separate hiding places scattered across the property, each documented with the precision of a man who had built an empire from sawdust and determination. Garrett turned to the final entries dated in March of 1943. The handwriting had grown shakier. The letters less precise, but the words remained legible. My son Robert believes this business is his birthright, that he is owed prosperity through blood alone rather than character or commitment. He has no understanding of what built this company, no respect for the men who labored here, no vision beyond his own comfort. I have watched him for 40 years, hoping he would change, hoping he would grow into the man this legacy requires. He has not. He will not. I have made provisions. Let the land decide who is worthy of what I built. Let time separate the patient from the entitled. Whoever finds this will have purchased what my son will surely abandon. May you prove worthier than my blood. The entry was dated March 17th, 1943. 2 weeks before Cornelius Braddock's death, according to the brass plate beneath his portrait, Garrett read those final words 3 times, trying to parse the bitterness contained in them. A father disinheriting his son, not through legal channels but through concealment. Cornelius had apparently left the sawmill to Robert in his official will along with the house and the timber contracts. But the wealth he had accumulated across a lifetime of work, the foundation of everything he had built, that he had hidden away with instructions only discoverable by someone who actually occupied the property long enough to stumble upon its secrets. The son had clearly sold everything off eventually. The dates on the abandoned paperwork throughout the building suggested the sawmill had operated sporadically through the 1970s before closing permanently around 2007. 64 years of the Braddock family slowly liquidating their inheritance without ever finding what really mattered. And now that inheritance potentially belonged to Garrett Sullivan, a 32-year-old construction worker who had bought the property in desperation, not ambition, who had signed those foreclosure papers because he needed a roof for his daughter, not because he saw opportunity in decay. Dad, Nora's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you okay? Garrett looked up from the ledger to his daughter's concerned face, then back down to the page before him. The page that contained directions to 6 different locations on the sawmill property. The page that listed in precise detail assets hidden over decades by a man who had apparently trusted no one with his fortune. Yeah, Garrett said slowly, his mind racing. Yeah, I'm okay. But he was not okay. He was standing in a hidden room holding a document that might be the ravings of a bitter old man, or might be a map to wealth beyond anything Garrett had ever imagined. The numbers in the ledger were staggering. Even accounting for the passage of time, even assuming some caches might have been discovered or deteriorated over 7 decades, Garrett was potentially looking at enough money to change his and Nora's lives permanently, not just solve their immediate crisis, not just get them out of sleeping bags on office floors, rewrite their entire future, if it was real. If Cornelius had not been delusional, if the caches had not already been found by urban explorers or previous owners or scrap metal hunters, if the landmarks referenced in the maps still existed after 7 decades of growth and decay, if Garrett could actually locate and excavate the hiding spots. Too many ifs. But also, what choice did he have? The ledger was either legitimate or it was not. The only way to know was to look. Dad, Nora said, tugging at his sleeve. What did you find?" Garrett looked at his daughter at the hope and curiosity shining in her eyes for the first time in months. He thought about the sleeping bags on the floor, the camping stove in the corner, the uncertain future stretching ahead of them like an unlit road. "Maybe something important," he said carefully. "I need to do some investigating to find out." "Can I help investigate?" Garrett considered this. He would need to survey the property, identify the landmarks Cornelius had referenced, possibly start digging in frozen December ground. Some of that work Nora could participate in safely. And honestly, the idea of having company while he pursued what might be an elaborate wild goose chase appealed to him more than he wanted to admit. "Yeah," Garrett said, "you can help. But first, we need to get some supplies. And Nora. Yeah. This is our secret for now. We don't tell anyone what we found until we know if it means anything." "Okay." Nora nodded solemnly, understanding in her own 8-year-old way that this was important, that secrets sometimes needed keeping. "Our secret," she agreed. Garrett looked one more time at the portrait of Cornelius Braddock, meeting those painted eyes that seemed to assess him across the decades. A man who had built an empire and watched his own son fail to appreciate it. A man who had hidden his wealth rather than let it be squandered. Let the land decide who is worthy. Garrett did not know if he was worthy. He was just a guy who had run out of options and bought the cheapest roof he could find. But he was about to find out. The drive into Millbrook felt different now. 24 hours ago, Garrett had been a desperate man with $450 worth of shelter and no prospects beyond surviving the winter. Now he sat behind the wheel of his truck with a secret burning in his chest and a leather ledger locked in the glove compartment. Nora rode beside him in silence, sensing the shift in her father's energy without fully understanding its source. She had seen the book, watched him read through its pages with shaking hands, absorbed his instruction to keep quiet about their discovery. But the full weight of what they might have found remained beyond her 8-year-old comprehension, which was probably for the best. Millbrook's main street stretched before them in the gray morning light. A hardware store, a diner, a gas station, a bar called the Timber Room that probably served as the community's social hub. The kind of small-town American strip that existed in thousands of variations across the country, each one slowly fading as the industries that built them moved elsewhere. Garrett parked outside the hardware store, a place called Hensley's that looked like it had been there since Cornelius Braddock's time. The building's facade was weathered but well-maintained, its windows displaying an assortment of tools and supplies arranged with the care of someone who took pride in their work. "Stay in the truck for a minute," Garrett told Nora. "I need to buy some things." The interior of Hensley's smelled of sawdust and machine oil and metal, scents that reminded Garrett of every construction site he had ever worked, every project he had ever completed with his own hands. The familiar aroma settled something in his chest, grounding him in the physical world after the surreal discovery of the hidden room. An older man stood behind the counter, perhaps 75 years old, with a weathered face and calloused hands that marked him as someone who had done more than just sell tools over his lifetime. He looked up as Garrett entered, assessing the newcomer with the practiced eye of a small-town merchant. "Help you find something." Garrett had prepared a mental list. shovels, a good flashlight, work gloves, and a metal detector if they carried one. Equipment that could serve multiple purposes but would primarily help him search for whatever Cornelius Braddock had buried 7 decades ago. "Need some excavation supplies," Garrett said. "Shovels, maybe a pickaxe. And I'm looking for a metal detector if you carry them." The man's eyebrows rose slightly. "You the fellow who bought the old Braddock place?" News traveled fast in small towns. Garrett should not have been surprised. "That's me. Garrett Sullivan." "Walter Hensley," the man said, extending a hand that engulfed Garrett's in a grip that still held considerable strength despite his age. "My grandfather worked at that sawmill back in the 20s and 30s. Said it was the best job in the county back then. Cornelius Braddock paid fair wages, treated his men right." Garrett felt a strange connection to the portrait hanging in that hidden room. The stern face with eyes that seemed to judge across decades, now given dimension by the words of someone whose family had actually known the man. "What happened to it?" Garrett asked. "To the company." Walter's expression soured, the lines around his mouth deepening. "Cornelius's son Robert, that's what happened. Man inherited a thriving business and ran it into the ground through pure neglect and arrogance. Raise wages to stay competitive. Never occurred to him. Modernize equipment too expensive. Treat workers with respect. Beneath him." The old man shook his head slowly, lost for a moment in memories that clearly still rankled. "By the time Robert died in the 80s, most of the good timber contracts had gone elsewhere. His own son, Cornelius's grandson, kept it limping along part-time until the recession hit in 2007. Then he just walked away, left everything to rot." The story aligned perfectly with what Garrett had read in Cornelius's final ledger entries. A legacy squandered by entitled heirs who had never understood what built it. "Well," Garrett said, keeping his voice casual, "I'm hoping to make something of the place. Starting small, but who knows?" Walter studied him with an assessing gaze that seemed to penetrate deeper than comfortable. "What exactly are you planning to excavate?" Garrett had anticipated this question and prepared a plausible cover story. "Previous owner left a lot of junk buried around the property. Old equipment, scrap metal. Figured I'd dig it up, sell what I can for scrap. Clean the place up." Walter nodded slowly, accepting the explanation. "Metal detectors over here. Got a good one, professional grade. Cost you, though." The detector was $230 more than Garrett had budgeted, but necessary if he was going to locate metal caches buried 4 feet underground. He added 2 shovels, work gloves, a pickaxe, and a heavy-duty flashlight to his purchases. The total came to $315, leaving Garrett with less than $100 to his name. As Walter rang up the purchase, he said casually, "You know, there's been stories about that sawmill for years. Folks say old Cornelius hid money all over the property before he died. Urban legend type stuff. But the stories persist." Garrett kept his expression carefully neutral, despite the sudden acceleration of his heartbeat. "People say that about a lot of old places. Usually just wishful thinking." "Usually," Walter agreed. But Cornelius Braddock wasn't like most people. Man survived the Depression by being smarter and more careful than everyone around him. Wouldn't surprise me if the stories had some truth to them. Their eyes met for a moment, and Garrett sensed something beneath the surface of the casual conversation. Walter Hensley was not just making small talk. He was probing, testing. "I'll let you know if I find anything interesting," Garrett said lightly. He gathered his purchases and headed for the door, hyper-aware of the ledger waiting in his truck's glove compartment. If there were already rumors about hidden wealth at the sawmill, he would need to be careful. The last thing he needed was treasure hunters or opportunistic locals taking an interest in his activities. Back in the truck, Nora eyed the equipment with undisguised excitement. "Are we going treasure hunting?" "We're going investigating," Garrett corrected gently. "Big difference. Treasure hunting is about getting rich quick. Investigating is about carefully seeing if something might be true." But even as he spoke the words, Garrett could feel the distinction blurring in his own mind. The numbers in Cornelius's ledger kept echoing through his thoughts. Gold coins, bearer bonds, cash hidden in locations mapped with engineering precision. If even a fraction of it was real, their lives would never be the same. The eastern marker stone sat exactly where Cornelius's maps indicated it would be. Garrett found it at the property's eastern edge, a massive boulder probably weighing several tons that had clearly been there since long before the sawmill was built. Glacial deposit, maybe. The kind of permanent landmark that would survive decades, centuries, millennia. Old enough to have been there in 1891, when Cornelius first purchased the land. Distinctive enough to serve as an unmistakable reference point. The ledger indicated the first cache was buried 12 feet due north of the stone's northern face, at a depth of 4 feet. Garrett had brought a tape measure along with the excavation equipment, and he stretched it out from the boulder with hands that wanted to tremble. 12 feet north. Exactly as specified. Nora watched from a safe distance as he assembled the metal detector, her small face serious with concentration. She understood without being told that this moment mattered, that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether her father's excitement was justified or misplaced. Garrett swept the detector over the marked spot. The machine shrieked immediately. Its digital readout indicated significant metal presence at approximately 4 feet down. Garrett's heart hammered against his ribs. It could be anything. Old equipment, scrap metal. Exactly what he had told Walter Hensley he expected to find. But the location was too precise, the depth too exact to Cornelius's specifications. This was no coincidence. "Is there treasure there?" Nora asked, her voice hushed. "There's definitely something metal buried there," Garrett said carefully. "We'll dig and find out what." The excavation took longer than anticipated. The ground was half frozen, resistant to the shovel's blade despite the warming midday sun. Garrett worked steadily, breaking through the top layer of hardened earth to reach the softer soil beneath. His back ached. His hands blistered despite the gloves. Sweat dampened his shirt beneath his jacket. Nora helped by clearing away the dirt he excavated, piling it neatly to one side with a child's dedication to imposed order. 2 hours of digging brought them to a depth of 3 feet. Marcus's doubt had begun creeping in, whispering that the metal detector had picked up some random buried debris, that Cornelius's maps were deliberately misleading, a final joke on whoever might find them. Then his shovel struck something solid with a metallic clang that echoed across the empty property. Garrett dropped to his knees at the bottom of the hole, using his gloved hands to brush away soil from what his shovel had hit. Metal emerged beneath his fingers, pitted with rust, but intact. A box maybe 2 feet long and a foot wide, constructed from heavy steel. No lock, just a simple latched lid. "Is that it?" Nora called from above, leaning over the edge of the hole with barely contained excitement. "Is that the treasure?" Garrett lifted the box carefully. It was heavy in a way that suggested contents beyond empty metal. Substantial. Significant. He climbed out of the hole and set the box on level ground. Nora crowded close, her earlier promise to stay at a safe distance forgotten in the intensity of the moment. The latch resisted briefly rust and time making it stubborn. Then it gave way with a squeal of protest. Garrett lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oil-treated canvas that had survived 7 decades underground, were neat stacks of gold coins. They gleamed dully in the weak December sunlight, their surfaces worn but unmistakable. Double eagles. $20 gold pieces minted in the early 20th century. Garrett recognized them from history books, from antique shows he had wandered through during better times when browsing interesting objects seemed like a reasonable way to spend an afternoon. He counted quickly, his fingers trembling as they touched metal that had last felt human contact when Franklin Roosevelt was president. 50 coins visible, maybe more beneath the top layer. At modern gold prices accounting for collector premiums and the coin's historical significance, he was looking at somewhere north of $100,000 in the first cache alone. "Daddy," Nora whispered, her voice small with awe. "We're rich." Garrett stared at the gold coins gleaming in the winter sunlight. Rich. The word felt foreign, impossible. 24 hours ago, he had less than $500 to his name and no prospects, beyond hoping construction work resumed in spring. Now he was looking at more money than he had earned in a year, possibly in 5 years. And this was just the first of 6 caches. "We need to be very careful," Garrett said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "We can't tell anyone about this. Not yet. Not until I figure out what we're supposed to do." Nora nodded seriously, understanding in her own 8-year-old way that this discovery changed everything. That secrets this big required protection. "It's our secret," she confirmed. "Our secret." Garrett agreed. He reburied the box, marking the location carefully, so he could retrieve it later and filled in the hole. No point leaving evidence of their discovery visible to anyone who might wander onto the property. Then he and Nora returned to the sawmill, Garrett's mind churning through implications and possibilities, while his daughter chattered excitedly about gold coins and secret rooms, and the adventure she had decided she liked after all. Over the next 3 days, while Nora attended the small school Garrett had hastily enrolled her in, he excavated the remaining 5 caches. Each location matched Cornelius's specifications with uncanny precision. Each cache yielded treasures similar to the first. Gold coins, old currency in denominations that spoke of a different era. Bearer bonds that Garrett suspected might still be redeemable through some lengthy but legitimate process. The work was exhausting. Solitary digging in frozen ground muscles screaming in protest, hands raw beneath multiple layers of gloves. But with each cache unearthed, with each confirmation that Cornelius Braddock had been neither delusional nor deceptive, Garrett's sense of unreality deepened. By the end of the 3rd day, he had recovered all 6 caches. He spread the contents across the floor of the hidden office that night. after Nora had fallen asleep in their makeshift living quarters one floor up. Gold coins sorted into stacks. Currency bundled by denomination. Bearer bonds laid out like ancient manuscripts requiring careful interpretation. The total was staggering. Even with conservative estimates, he was looking at close to $800,000 in gold and currency alone. The bearer bonds, if still redeemable, might add another $200,000, nearly $1 million. The number felt absurd, unreal, like something from a story rather than something that could actually happen to a man like Garrett Sullivan. A man who had been sleeping on a concrete floor because he could not afford rent on a moldy trailer. A man whose wife had walked out without explanation, whose daughter had learned to expect disappointment, whose future had seemed to consist of nothing but struggle, stretching toward an uncertain horizon. Now he sat surrounded by wealth that could solve every problem he had ever faced, if he kept it. The question had been gnawing at Garrett since he opened the first cache. Cornelius Braddock had hidden this wealth intentionally, creating a system that rewarded patience and occupancy over blood inheritance. His descendants had owned the land for decades and sold it off without discovering what lay beneath. Their loss, legally speaking. Garrett had researched enough to know that found assets on private property belonged to the property owner. He had purchased the sawmill through legitimate foreclosure proceedings. Whatever lay buried on the land was his by right of purchase. But law and morality did not always align. Cornelius had written about wanting the land to decide who was worthy. But land did not decide anything. People did. Garrett had stumbled into this situation by accident, not design. Did that make him worthy or just lucky? And what about Cornelius's descendants? The Braddock family had owned this property for generations. They had failed to find the caches, yes. But did that failure forfeit all moral claim to wealth accumulated by their ancestor? These questions kept Garrett awake long after he had secured the recovered treasure and climbed into his sleeping bag beside his daughter. He did not have answers, but he had a feeling answers would be demanded soon. The phone call came 3 days after Garrett completed his excavations. He was in the hidden office reading through Cornelius's ledger, yet again searching for guidance the old man might have left between the lines of his precise handwriting. Nora was at school. The sawmill sat silent around him, its ancient timbers creaking in the winter wind. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Local area code. Garrett Sullivan. A woman's voice, professional and clipped. Speaking. My name is Vivian Braddock Holloway. I understand you recently purchased the Braddock Sawmill property. Garrett's stomach dropped. Braddock, a descendant. Calling him less than a week after he had found Cornelius's first cache. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. That's right, Garrett said, carefully keeping his voice neutral. Can I help you with something? I'd like to meet with you, Vivian said. Discuss the property, its history. I'm Cornelius Braddock's great-granddaughter. My family has some interest in the site's historical preservation. Historical preservation. Code for searching for Cornelius's hidden wealth, most likely. Walter Hensley's casual mention of the legend suddenly seemed less innocent. Word had spread that someone new owned the sawmill, and now Cornelius's descendants were circling. I'm not looking to sell, Garrett said. I'm not looking to buy, Vivian countered smoothly. Just to talk. I'm in town tomorrow. Perhaps we could meet at the property. Say 10 in the morning. Garrett wanted to refuse, but curiosity won. He wanted to see what Cornelius's great-granddaughter knew what she wanted. And maybe despite everything he wanted to look her in the eye and try to determine whether she deserved to know about the wealth her ancestor had deliberately hidden from her family. 10 works, Garrett agreed. After the call ended, Garrett sat in the hidden office listening to Nora's absence and the building's quiet, settling sounds. Tomorrow would bring complications he was not prepared for. A confrontation between blood inheritance and purchase discovery, between what was legal and what might be right. He looked up at Cornelius's portrait, studying the stern face with new attention. What would the old man say if he could see his great-granddaughter coming to claim what he had specifically denied her lineage? Would he approve of Garrett keeping the secret? Or would he expect something else entirely? Vivian Braddock Holloway arrived at exactly 10 o'clock. She drove a silver sedan that looked aggressively out of place against the sawmill's industrial decay. Not new, Garrett noticed, but well-maintained. The kind of car someone bought when they wanted to project success without actually possessing it. She emerged dressed in what Garrett recognized as expensive casual wear. The kind of clothing designed to look effortless while probably costing more than his monthly grocery budget used to be. Mid-40s, he guessed, with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, and the confident posture of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. But there were cracks in the facade. The car was at least 8 years old. Her shoes, while stylish, showed wear at the heels. And beneath the confident posture, Garrett detected something he recognized intimately from his own mirror. Exhaustion. The kind that came from fighting too long with too little. Nora watched from the second-floor window as Garrett descended to meet their visitor. He had told his daughter to stay inside during this conversation, a precaution that felt increasingly necessary as Vivian approached with the measured stride of someone assessing property value. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, extending a hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Her handshake was firm, professional. Garrett noted she wore no wedding ring, and her eyes were already scanning the sawmill's exterior with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. "Ms. Braddock Holloway," Garrett replied. "You said you wanted to discuss the property's history. Please call me Vivian." She turned her full attention to him, and Garrett recognized the expression. Assessment. She was trying to determine what kind of person she was dealing with, how much he might know, what leverage she might have. "My great-grandfather built this place. It's been connected to my family for over a century, even if we no longer own it." "Your family sold it," Garrett pointed out. "Several times, from what I understand. It went through at least 3 different owners before the bank foreclosed." Vivian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My uncle made decisions I didn't agree with. He saw the sawmill as a burden, an unprofitable relic. He never understood what Cornelius built here." "And what did Cornelius build here exactly?" Vivian turned to study the sawmill's looming facade, her expression shifting to something that might have been genuine nostalgia. "An empire for a time. Cornelius Braddock came to Montana with nothing in 1890. By 1920, he controlled timber contracts across 3 counties. He employed over 200 men at the operation's peak, paid them, fairly treated them with respect. My great-grandfather believed in building something that would last, a legacy for his family. But it didn't last, Garrett observed. No. Vivian's voice carried bitter acknowledgement. My grandfather, Robert, inherited ambition without skill, arrogance without vision. He spent 40 years slowly dismantling what Cornelius built, and my uncle finished the job. She turned back to Garrett, her eyes sharp despite the pain underlying her words. Which brings me to why I'm here. There are family stories about Cornelius, things he may have left behind that weren't part of the official estate. Garrett kept his expression neutral. What kind of things? Vivian studied him carefully before responding. Cornelius didn't trust banks. The Depression reinforced that distrust. Family legend suggests he may have kept assets hidden on the property, insurance against economic collapse. My uncle dismissed these stories as fantasy, but I've done research. I've found references in old letters, cryptic, mentions in family documents. I believe the stories are true. And you want to search my property for your great-grandfather's hidden treasure, Garrett said flatly. I want to recover assets that rightfully belong to Cornelius's bloodline, Vivian corrected. You purchased the building and land, Mr. Sullivan. No one disputes that. But if there are family heirlooms or assets hidden here, those weren't part of the sale. They remain family property. Garrett had anticipated this argument. That's not how property law works. I bought the land and everything on it. Anything found on the property belongs to me. Legally, perhaps, Vivian conceded. But morally, these are my family's assets, hidden by my great-grandfather for his descendants. The fact that my grandfather and uncle were too blind or lazy to find them doesn't change the fundamental ownership. And the fact that Cornelius apparently hid them specifically so his son wouldn't find them, Garrett asked quietly. Does that change the fundamental ownership? Vivian's eyes widened slightly. What do you know about that? Garrett realized his mistake too late. He had revealed knowledge that should not be accessible to someone who had only owned the property for a few days. But backing down now would only make things worse. I found Cornelius's hidden office, Garrett said, and I found his ledger. I know exactly what he thought of his son Robert and why he hid what he hid. For a long moment, Vivian simply stared at him. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. A sound without much humor, but genuine nonetheless. So, you actually found it. The room everyone whispered about, but no one could locate. How? My daughter has a talent for finding things that don't want to be found, Garrett said. Vivian's expression shifted. Calculation replacing surprise. Then you know where the caches are located. You know what's buried here. I know what might be buried here, Garrett said carefully. I haven't verified everything. It was a lie, but a necessary one. Vivian did not need to know about the gold coins and currency and bearer bonds currently secured in the hidden office. Mr. Sullivan, Vivian said, her tone becoming more conciliatory. Garrett, I understand this puts you in a difficult position. You purchased this property legally, and you have every right to anything you find here. But I'm asking you to consider the ethical dimensions. Cornelius was my family. His wealth was built through generations of work. Does the fact that you happen to buy this building give you moral right to everything he accumulated? Does the fact that you share his blood give you moral right to wealth he specifically hid from his descendants? Garrett countered. Vivian flinched as if struck. You read what he wrote about my grandfather, she said quietly. I did. Robert was a difficult man, Vivian acknowledged. Entitled, arrogant, dismissive of others. Everything Cornelius wrote about him was probably true. But that doesn't define our entire family. I barely knew Robert. He died when I was 12. I'm not asking for this inheritance because I think I deserve it through some divine right of blood. I'm asking because I've spent my adult life trying to understand Cornelius, trying to honor what he built in ways my grandfather and uncle never did. Garrett studied her, trying to gauge sincerity versus manipulation. What does that mean, honoring what he built? Vivian pulled out her phone, scrolling through images before handing it to Garrett. The screen showed historical documents, photographs, research materials, academic articles bearing Vivian's name, photographs of Cornelius at various stages of his life, copies of Sawmill operational records from decades past. I'm a historian, Mr. Sullivan. I specialize in early 20th century industrial development in the American West. I've written 2 books about timber industry evolution. Cornelius's story is part of that history, and I've been documenting it for 15 years. Garrett scrolled through the images. The research was extensive, genuine. So you want the money to fund more research? I want the money because I'm 46 years old, divorced, teaching adjunct classes at 3 different colleges to make ends meet, and living in my sister's basement, Vivian said bluntly. I want it because I'm Cornelius's great-granddaughter. And I'm broke while his wealth sits buried on property sold off by people who never appreciated what they had. I want it because, yes, it would help me. And unlike my grandfather and uncle, I would actually do something meaningful with it. The raw honesty in her voice surprised Garrett. He had expected legal arguments or emotional manipulation, not this direct acknowledgement of personal desperation. It was, he realized, something he could deeply relate to. 2 people standing on opposite sides of an inheritance neither had expected, both struggling with circumstances beyond their control, both grasping for something that might change everything. I need time to think about this, Garrett said finally. Vivian nodded slowly. How much time? I don't know. A few days at least. And in the meantime, you'll excavate what you can, and then decide how much to share. Garrett met her gaze steadily. In the meantime, I'll read more of Cornelius's ledger, understand what he wanted, and try to figure out the right thing to do, which is more consideration than you or your family gave this place for 70 years. Vivian absorbed the words quietly. That's fair, she said eventually. More than fair, actually. She pulled a business card from her purse and handed it to Garrett. Dr. Vivian Braddock Holloway, Adjunct Professor of History. That's my number. When you're ready to talk, call me. She paused. And Garrett, thank you for not just telling me to leave. Garrett watched her walk back to her aging sedan, her confident posture slightly diminished by their conversation. She climbed in and drove away without looking back, leaving him standing in the sawmill shadow, with her business card in his hand, and questions multiplying in his mind. That evening, after Nora had gone to sleep, Garrett returned to the hidden office, He sat in the darkness with only his phone's flashlight for illumination, reading through Cornelius's ledger for the dozenth time. Searching for guidance, the old man might have left between the lines. One entry caught his attention differently tonight. Built the Eastern cache today. Buried enough to keep Sarah and the children comfortable if the banks fail again. Robert watched me work but asked no questions. Showed no curiosity about why his father might be digging holes on his own property. The boy takes everything for granted, believes wealth appears through birthright rather than effort. He will inherit this business and likely destroy it. So be it. A man can only control what he can control. Another entry from 1938. The land remembers. Trees I planted 40 years ago now tower over the mill. Families I employed in the 90s now send their sons to work here. What we build becomes part of something larger than ourselves. Robert sees only the immediate, the transactional. He will sell this all eventually, I have no doubt. But the land will remain, and maybe someone worthy will find what I've hidden and understand what it means. The land will remain. Garrett looked around the hidden office at the portrait of Cornelius watching from the wall at the shelves of carefully preserved records at the desk, where an old man had written his final thoughts before death claimed him. Cornelius had not simply hidden wealth. He had created a test, a system designed to reward someone who actually occupied and cared for the property, rather than someone who simply inherited it. And Vivian. She was not Robert. She was not the entitled son who had taken everything for granted. She was a woman who had spent 15 years researching her ancestors' legacy while living in her sister's basement. Did blood matter or did effort? Did legal ownership settle the question? Or did moral complexity demand something more nuanced? Garrett did not have answers, but he was beginning to understand the questions. 3 days passed in contemplation. Garrett worked on the sawmill during daylight hours, making repairs that the building desperately needed, keeping his hands busy, while his mind wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. He fixed broken windows, patched holes in the roof, got the ancient boiler system limping along well enough to provide heat to their living quarters. Physical labor had always been his way of thinking. The rhythm of hammer and nail, the satisfaction of visible progress, the honest exhaustion that came from work well done. These things grounded him in a way that sitting and pondering never could. Nora watched her father with the careful attention of a child who had learned to read adult moods for survival. She did not ask about the treasure or about the woman who had visited. She seemed to understand that her father was working through something important, and that patience was the kindest thing she could offer. At night, after Nora fell asleep, Garrett returned to the hidden office. He would sit in Cornelius Braddock's chair, beneath Cornelius Braddock's portrait, reading through the ledger by flashlight, until the words began to blur. Searching for wisdom from a man who had been dead for over 80 years. The entry from 1934 spoke to him most directly. Built the Eastern cache today. Buried enough to keep Sarah and the children comfortable if the banks fail again. Robert watched me work but asked no questions. Showed no curiosity about why his father might be digging holes on his own property. The boy takes everything for granted, believes wealth appears through birthright rather than effort. Garrett understood that frustration intimately. He had watched men on construction sites who treated their positions as entitlements rather than responsibilities, who expected promotions without proving themselves worthy, who resented the success of others without examining their own lack of effort. But he also understood something Cornelius perhaps had not. Sometimes people surprised you. Sometimes the entitled child grew into a thoughtful adult. Sometimes blood carried more than just genes. It carried possibility. The entry from 1938 offered different wisdom. The land remembers. Trees I planted 40 years ago now tower over the mill. Families I employed in the 90s now send their sons to work here. What we build becomes part of something larger than ourselves. What we build becomes part of something larger than ourselves. Garrett looked around the hidden office at the careful preservation of records and memories, at the portrait of a man who had created an empire from nothing and then watched his own son begin its destruction. Cornelius had not simply hidden wealth out of spite. He had created a system, a test, a way of ensuring that whoever eventually found his legacy would be someone who had actually invested in the property, rather than simply inherited it. But systems could not account for everything. Vivian Braddock Holloway had not inherited the sawmill. She had not been given the opportunity to fail or succeed with it. Her grandfather and uncle had made those choices for her, selling off pieces of the legacy before she was old enough to have a voice. Was it fair to judge her by their failures? Was it fair to reward Garrett simply because he had been desperate enough to buy a building no one else wanted? On the third night, Garrett made his decision. He called Vivian the next morning. "I want to meet again," he said when she answered. "Tomorrow afternoon, the diner in Millbrook, 2 o'clock. I'll be there." Vivian said, her voice carefully neutral, despite what must have been considerable anxiety. "Should I bring anything documentation of my research family records?" "Just yourself," Garrett said. "We need to talk, really talk, without agendas or arguments." The line was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," Vivian said finally, "for giving me a chance." Garrett arrived at the diner early, claiming a booth in the back where they could talk privately. The lunch crowd had mostly departed, leaving only a few locals nursing coffee and pie at the counter. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with a name tag that said Dorothy, took his order for coffee and promised to check back when his guest arrived. Vivian appeared at exactly 2 o'clock. She looked different than she had at the sawmill, less polished, more human. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in that severe ponytail. The change made her seem younger somehow, or perhaps just more accessible. She slid into the booth across from him, her hands clasped on the table in front of her, waiting. Garrett had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, trying different approaches in his mind. Direct honesty seemed like the only version that felt right. "I found all 6 caches," he said. Vivian's breath caught audibly. The contents matched Cornelius's descriptions in the ledger. Gold coins, old currency, bearer bonds. "How much?" Vivian asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'd estimate close to $1 million in current value. Possibly more depending on the bonds." Vivian closed her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly on the table. $1 million, she repeated. Give or take, Garrett confirmed. Silence stretched between them. Dorothy approached with a coffee pot, and Vivian ordered tea without really looking at her. The waitress departed, sensing that this conversation required privacy. I've spent 3 days thinking about what's right, Garrett continued. Not what's legal, not what benefits me most. What's actually right. Vivian opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with an intensity that felt almost physical. And what did you decide? Garrett pulled Cornelius's ledger from his jacket and set it on the table between them. Your great-grandfather wrote that he wanted the land to decide who was worthy. But land doesn't decide anything. People do. So I'm deciding. He paused, making sure he had her full attention. I'm keeping half. Vivian blinked. Half. Half, Garrett confirmed. I purchased this property legally. I found these caches through my own effort and my daughter's curiosity. I need this money to give Nora a stable life opportunities she won't have otherwise. That's worth something. And the other half, Vivian asked carefully, goes to you. The words hung in the air between them. Not because you're entitled to it through blood, Garrett continued, but because you're the only member of Cornelius's family who actually cared about what he built. You spent 15 years documenting his legacy while everyone else forgot he existed. You live in your sister's basement, teaching adjunct classes because you chose scholarship over profit. That's worth something too. Vivian sat perfectly still, processing his words. You're serious, she said finally. Completely. We split it down the middle. You use your half however you want. I'll do the same. No legal fights. No arguments about who deserves more. Just a clean split between two people who both need help and both have reasonable claims. That's incredibly generous, Vivian said, her voice thick with emotion. It's pragmatic, Garrett corrected. Fighting over this in court would cost both of us money and time neither of us can afford. This way, we both get enough to make real changes in our lives. And neither of us has to become the kind of person Cornelius was bitter about. Dorothy returned with Vivian's tea, setting it down with a curious glance at the obviously emotional woman. Garrett waited until she had retreated before continuing. You could have kept everything, Vivian said quietly, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. I have no proof the caches exist. No legal standing to demand anything. You could have told me you found nothing and I'd have no way to challenge it. I could have, Garrett agreed. But then I'd be exactly the kind of person your great-grandfather was bitter about. Someone taking what they didn't earn. Claiming what they don't fully deserve. I'm not that person. And I don't want Nora growing up thinking that's acceptable. Vivian's eyes filled with tears that she did not bother to hide. My great-grandfather would have liked you, she said. Maybe, Garrett replied. Or maybe he'd be furious that I'm sharing with his bloodline at all. But I like to think he'd understand that sometimes the right answer is more complicated than absolute judgment allows. They talked for 2 more hours. Vivian shared stories about her research, about the years she had spent piecing together Cornelius's life from scattered documents and fading photographs. She talked about her grandfather Robert, a man she had barely known, but whose shadow had loomed over her entire family. About her uncle Edmund, who had sold the sawmill in 2007 and washed his hands of the Braddock legacy entirely. Garrett talked about his construction work, about the satisfaction of building things that would outlast him, about Claire leaving, about the 2 years of struggle that had followed, about the desperation that had led him to buy a building no sane person would want, about Nora, who had found the hidden door and changed everything. By the time they finished talking, the diner had filled with the early dinner crowd, and Dorothy was eyeing their booth with pointed impatience. Garrett paid for both of their orders over Vivian's protests, and they walked out into the cold December evening together. "How do we do this?" Vivian asked. "Practically speaking, converting old currency and bonds into usable money without attracting attention." "Carefully," Garrett said. "Slowly. I know a guy in Helena who deals in antique coins. He's discreet, and the bonds will need to go through official channels, but that's a matter of paperwork rather than legality. We own this stuff. We just need to be smart about how we liquidate it." Vivian nodded. "I know an appraiser, someone I've worked with on historical projects. He can value the items without asking uncomfortable questions." "Good. We'll take it one step at a time. No rush." They stood in the parking lot, two strangers who had become something else over the course of an afternoon. Not friends exactly, but allies, partners in an unexpected inheritance. "Thank you," Vivian said again, "for being the kind of person who does the right thing, even when no one would know the difference." Garrett thought about Cornelius's portrait, those painted eyes that seemed to assess him across decades. About the ledger's final words, "Let the land decide who is worthy." "I'm not sure I'm doing the right thing," he admitted. "I'm just trying to do something I can live with." Vivian smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. "That might be the same thing," she said. The months that followed moved with the strange compression that accompanies life-changing events. Garrett and Vivian worked together to liquidate the assets Cornelius had hidden away decades before. The gold coins sold through 3 different dealers over 6 months, each transaction carefully structured to avoid suspicion. The old currency went to collectors who paid premiums for bills that had not circulated since the Roosevelt administration. The bearer bonds, remarkably, were still redeemable. The process took nearly a year of paperwork and patience, but eventually they converted paper promises into actual money. The final accounting exceeded their initial estimates. $800,000 from the gold and currency, $215,000 from the bonds, just over $1 million total. Split down the middle, $507,000 each. Garrett opened his first real bank account in years. He deposited the money in careful increments, building a foundation of stability that had seemed impossible just months before. He enrolled Nora in a better school. He bought furniture for their living quarters in the sawmill. He hired contractors to repair the most critical structural issues. But he did not stop there. The sawmill had space, enormous amounts of space. 3 floors of industrial capacity that had sat empty for 17 years, waiting for someone with vision and resources to reimagine its purpose. Garrett had never thought of himself as a visionary. He was a construction worker, a man who built things with his hands. But standing in the cavernous main floor of the Braddock sawmill, he began to see possibilities. The ground floor became workshop space. Garrett divided the massive processing area into smaller units, each one suitable for a craftsperson or small business owner who needed affordable space to work. He kept the rent low below market rate because he remembered what it was like to struggle for basic necessities. A furniture maker took the first space, then a potter, then a woman who made custom leather goods by hand. Word spread through Millbrook and the surrounding communities that the old sawmill had new life, that someone was actually investing in the valley again. By the end of the second year, 12 small businesses operated out of the Braddock Sawmill. The upper floors became affordable housing. Garrett converted the old offices into simple but comfortable apartments, prioritizing artists and craftspeople who needed both workspace and living quarters. The rents he charged barely covered maintenance costs, but that was intentional. He had enough money now. What he wanted was community. Nora thrived in ways Garrett had not dared to hope. The stability transformed her. The constant anxiety that had shadowed her features since Claire left began to fade, replaced by the natural confidence of a child who knew she was safe and loved. She made friends at her new school. She joined the art club. She started drawing pictures full of bright colors and smiling faces instead of the muted, careful images she had produced during their years of struggle. She turned 9, then 10, then 11, growing taller, growing more sure of herself, growing into the kind of person Garrett had always hoped she might become. And through it all, she never forgot the secret room. Nora would visit Cornelius's hidden office regularly, sitting in the old man's chair and studying his portrait with something like reverence. She read through the ledger until she had memorized portions of it, understanding more fully as she grew older what Cornelius had done and why. He wasn't just hiding money, she told Garrett one evening when she was 12. He was hiding a test. What kind of test? Garrett asked, though he had reached similar conclusions himself. A test to find someone worthy, Nora said. Someone who would actually care about this place instead of just taking what they could get from it. Garrett smiled at his daughter, marveling at the perceptive young woman she was becoming. And did we pass the test? Nora considered the question seriously. I think we're still taking it, she said, finally. Every day we decide what to do with what he gave us. Every day we get to choose whether we're worthy or not. Garrett could not have said it better himself. Vivian became a regular visitor to the sawmill. She came quarterly at first, combining trips to research Cornelius's papers with an informal friendship that had developed between her and Garrett. Her life had transformed along with his. The inheritance allowed her to quit 2 of her 3 adjunct positions. She used the financial stability to complete a book specifically about Cornelius Braddock and the immigrant entrepreneurs who had built Montana's timber industry. The book found a major academic publisher. It earned strong reviews in historical journals, and it led eventually to a tenure-track position at a university in Seattle. But she still made time to return to Millbrook. You know what I keep thinking about, she said during one visit, standing with Garrett in the now bustling workshop space while craftspeople worked around them. Cornelius spent his whole life building something permanent, and his son destroyed it in a generation. But then you came along and you're building again. Different vision, different purpose, but the same fundamental drive. Creating something that will outlast you. Garrett looked around at the workshop spaces full of activity. The furniture maker shaping wood at his lathe. The potter throwing clay on her wheel. the leather worker cutting patterns for custom bags. "I don't think I'm that ambitious," he said. "I just wanted a roof that didn't leak and enough money to give Nora stability." "That's exactly what Cornelius wanted," Vivian replied. "Stability for his family. A legacy that would last. You're more similar than you realize." Walter Hensley from the hardware store became a regular presence at the sawmill, too. The old man had connections to the Braddock legacy that Garrett had not initially understood. His grandfather had worked for Cornelius in the 1920s and 1930s. His father had worked there after the war. Walter himself had done summer jobs at the mill before Robert's mismanagement drove the good workers elsewhere. He came to offer advice to the younger craftspeople sharing techniques his grandfather had learned during the sawmill's heyday. Traditional woodworking methods, ways of reading grain and selecting lumber that industrial processes had forgotten. Knowledge that connected the present to a past that had shaped the entire valley. Cornelius would have approved of this. Walter told Garrett one afternoon watching a group of high school students learn joinery techniques from the furniture maker. He always said a business should make the community stronger, not just extract profit from it. That sounds like something he might have written. Garrett agreed. He probably did write it somewhere. Man documented everything. Part of why the stories about hidden treasure persisted so long. People figured someone that organized must have left records about where he put his money. Garrett smiled but said nothing. Some secrets were worth keeping. 5 years after Garrett Sullivan signed the foreclosure papers on the Braddock sawmill, a package arrived from a law firm in Billings. The return address meant nothing to him. Sullivan had no connections to Billings beyond the occasional supply run for specialized materials. He opened the package with mild curiosity and found a photograph in an old wooden frame, accompanied by a handwritten letter. The photograph showed the sawmill in its prime. Early 1920s, Garrett estimated based on the vehicles visible in the background. Timber stacks rose like mountains around the building. Workers stood in organized rows before the main entrance, wearing the clothes and expressions of men who took pride in honest labor. And there, standing prominently in the front row, was Cornelius Braddock himself. He looked perhaps 40 years younger than in the portrait hanging in the hidden office. Strong and vital, a man in his prime surveying the empire he had built from nothing. The same stern expression, but tempered by something that might have been satisfaction, pride in what he had accomplished. The letter was written in shaky script that suggested it had been composed near the end of someone's life. "Mr. Sullivan, I will never meet you, but my niece Vivian tells me you are a man my great-grandfather would have respected. I was not such a man. I am Edmund Braddock, Jr., Cornelius's grandson. I am 87 years old, and I will not see 88. I inherited my father Robert's arrogance and squandered everything Cornelius built through pure neglect and pride. By the time I understood what I had lost, it was too late to recover it. I sold the sawmill in 2007 because I no longer had the courage to face my own failure every day. Vivian tells me you found what my family was too blind to see for 70 years. She tells me you chose to share it, despite having no legal obligation to do so. This act of generosity shames me in ways I cannot adequately express. I could have searched for those caches myself during the decades I owned the property. I chose not to. I dismissed the family stories as fantasy. I refuse to honor my great-grandfather's memory by actually trying to understand him. Vivian tells me you have transformed the Sawmill into something new, a community of craftspeople, a place where people create things that matter. My great-grandfather would have recognized that purpose even if the specific application would have surprised him. Cornelius wrote, "Let the land decide who is worthy. The land chose you. I have no right to ask anything of you, but I make one request nonetheless. Remember that buildings are not legacies. People are. The sawmill mattered because of the lives my great-grandfather touched, the families he supported, the community he helped sustain. If you remember nothing else about the Braddock name, remember that. I am sending this photograph because it belongs with the building, not with me. I've kept it since I was a boy, thinking that possessing an image of something was the same as being worthy of it. I was wrong. The photograph belongs where the legacy lives on, and according to Vivian, that is with you. With respect, I have not earned Edmund Braddock Jr." Garrett read the letter 3 times, sitting in the hidden office beneath Cornelius's watchful portrait. Edmund had died by the time the letter arrived. The law firm's cover note confirmed as much. But his final words reached across that divide, carrying weight that transcended mortality. Buildings are not legacies. People are. Garrett looked up at Cornelius's stern face in the portrait, then down at the younger version in Edmund's photograph. The same man at different points in a life that had spanned depressions and world wars, and the rise and fall of industries. What Cornelius had really built was not a sawmill. It was a web of connections, families employed for generations, workers who took pride in their labor, a community that remembered him decades after his death. That was the inheritance worth preserving. Garrett hung Edmund's photograph beside Cornelius's portrait in the hidden office. 2 versions of the same man, separated by decades but connected by the space they had created to hide what mattered most. That evening, after the workshops had closed and the building had settled into nighttime quiet, Garrett stood in the hidden office one final time. Nora was 13 now, tall and confident in ways that sometimes caught him off guard. She had made this space her own over the years, adding her drawings to the walls, researching Cornelius's life with the dedication of someone who understood she was part of a larger story. She had asked to be left alone tonight, working on a school project about local history. Garrett suspected she was writing about the sawmill, about the secret room, about the gold coins and the old man's bitter hope and the stranger who had stumbled into his legacy. Some stories deserve to be told. Garrett studied Cornelius's portrait, meeting those painted eyes that had seemed to judge him 5 years ago when he first entered this room. "I hope this is what you wanted," he said quietly. "I kept half shared half. Tried to build something instead of just taking. Best I could figure." The portrait offered no response, but somehow the stern expression seemed softer tonight, more approving, as if the old man's ghost had finally found peace. "The land will remain," Garrett continued, quoting from the ledger he had memorized over years of reading. "And you were right. It does. But I think you were wrong about one thing." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You said the land would decide who was worthy. But land doesn't decide anything. People do. Every day, with every choice, we decide what we're going to be worthy of. You made your choice when you hid your wealth and wrote your bitter words. Your son made his choice when he squandered what you built. Your grandson made his choice when he sold everything and walked away. Garrett touched the frame of Edmund's photograph, the image of Cornelius young and proud. And I made my choice when I decided to share instead of keep. When I decided to build instead of consume. When I decided to make this place mean something again. He stepped back, looking at both versions of Cornelius side by side. Maybe none of us are worthy in the way you meant. Maybe worthiness isn't something you earn through grand gestures or perfect choices. Maybe it's something you build slowly day by day, trying to leave things better than you found them. Outside the hidden office, the sawmill creaked and settled old wood, accommodating itself to the evening's dropping temperature. The sounds no longer frightened Garrett as they had that first night. Now they felt familiar, comfortable, like the building was breathing around him, alive in its own ancient way. "Nora found your door," Garrett said. "A little girl who wasn't looking for treasure, just leaning against a wall while she drew pictures in her notebook. She wasn't worthy in any traditional sense. She was just curious, just present, just willing to notice what others had overlooked." He smiled slightly. Maybe that's the real test. Not who deserves the wealth, but who pays attention, who shows up, who stays when staying is hard, and leaving would be easier. He thought about the past 5 years, the transformation of the sawmill from ruin to community, the growth of his daughter from anxious child to confident teenager, the unexpected friendship with Vivian, the reconciliation with Edmund's ghost, the connections he had built with craftspeople and neighbors and the descendants of workers Cornelius had employed a century ago. "I don't know if I passed your test," Garrett admitted, "but I know I'm still taking it. Every day I get to decide what kind of person I want to be, what kind of legacy I want to leave for Nora, what kind of world I want to help build." He reached out and touched the portrait's frame, a gesture of connection across decades. "That's what you really left behind. Not the gold or the bonds or the cash. The choice. The opportunity to be worthy or not. The test that never ends." Garrett turned toward the hidden door, ready to return to the life he had built from Cornelius Braddock's bitter hope. Then he paused and looked back one more time. "Thank you," he said simply, "for hiding what you hid, for writing what you wrote, for giving a desperate man and his daughter a chance they never expected." The portrait watched in silence as Garrett closed the hidden door behind him, leaving Cornelius Braddock to his eternal vigil in the darkness. Outside, the Montana night spread vast and cold across the valley. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns unchanged since Cornelius first bought this land in 1890. The sawmill stood solid against the darkness, lights glowing in workshop windows where craftspeople worked late on projects that mattered to them. Garrett walked through the building he had transformed, nodding to the furniture maker finishing a commission, waving to the potter glazing pieces for tomorrow's kiln firing. Each person he passed represented a choice he had made, an investment in community over profit, a decision to build rather than simply possess. He climbed the stairs to the living quarters he and Nora had occupied for 5 years now. The space that had once been a bare office with sleeping bags on concrete was now a real home. Comfortable furniture, art on the walls, books on shelves, evidence of a life being lived rather than merely survived. Nora sat at her desk, surrounded by papers and photographs, working on her history project with the focused intensity she brought to everything she cared about. "How's it going?" Garrett asked. "Good," she said without looking up. "I'm writing about how legacies pass between generations, using the sawmill as a case study." "That sounds like a big topic for a school project." Nora finally looked up, her expression serious in the way that reminded Garrett of Cornelius's portrait. "Mrs. Patterson said I should narrow it down, but I don't think you can understand what happened here without understanding all of it. The building, the hiding, the finding, the choosing." "The choosing?" Garrett asked. "What you chose to do when you found the treasure." "That's the important part, not the gold. The choice." Garrett felt his throat tighten with emotion he did not try to hide. "When did you get so smart?" Nora smiled, the serious expression softening into something more childlike. "I had a good teacher." They sat together for a while, father and daughter, in the home they had built from nothing. Outside, the sawmill continued its quiet nighttime sounds, wood settling, wind finding gaps, the building breathing as it had for over a century. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove worthy or fall short, new chances to build or destroy. But tonight, Garrett allowed himself to feel what he had rarely permitted during the years of struggle and uncertainty: peace. The sawmill stood strong around them, shelter and legacy and possibility all wrapped into one ancient structure. Cornelius Braddock had built it with his own hands and his own vision. His descendants had squandered it through neglect and pride. And Garrett Sullivan, a desperate construction worker who had bought the cheapest roof available, had found something unexpected beneath the decay. Not just gold coins and bearer bonds, not just financial salvation. Purpose, the kind that came from building something larger than yourself, from creating community instead of just extracting profit, from choosing to be worthy rather than simply claiming you deserve to be. "Let the land decide who is worthy," Cornelius had written. But land did not decide anything. People did. And Garrett Sullivan, former construction worker, current sawmill owner, father of a remarkable daughter named Nora, had made his choice. He chose to build. He chose to share. He chose to honor a bitter old man's hidden hope by transforming it into something Cornelius probably never imagined, but would certainly have understood: a legacy worth leaving. The sawmill's timbers creaked one final time as the building settled into sleep. And somewhere in the hidden office behind the secret door that a curious 8-year-old had found 5 years ago, the portrait of Cornelius Braddock watched over the darkness with eyes that might have held a hint of approval. The land would remain. The building would stand. The choice would continue. And the secret that had waited 70 years for someone worthy to find it had finally at last come home.